Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Today we're going to talk about being a leader within tech, and we're going to talk about how you can do that in a way that is healthy and sustainable for you as an individual and a human. And so we'll be covering some of the hazards that can exist for us when we are put in a leadership position. A little bit about me. I am the CEO of a company called Verdant Consulting. We focus on workplace mental health, and we help organizations implement global guidelines for workplace mental health. We have affiliates from around the globe, and we partner with pretty much every industry. We do have a lot of clients in tech as well as cybersecurity. So this is an area that we spend a lot of time focusing on and thinking about on a day-to-day basis. So a chance for everyone to interact here. If you want to put your guess, according to this study that was done in 2022, what percent of IT was feeling burnt out, do you think? You can put your responses in the chat. So the answer is 82%, according to this study, 82% of IT feeling burned out. And 62% were considering quitting. And so we have a problem happening within our IT and tech teams. And leaders within tech are not immune, with 94% of leaders in tech reporting just general anxiety about the work they do. In fact, this just recently came out done, and you can see the greatest cause of anxiety was what you do every day, which is cybersecurity, followed closely by AI and machine learning. And so the other thing for us to think about is, so as we think about tech, we think about some of the ways in which we can experience that anxiety, that concern, because there's a lot of unknowns and it's constantly changing and needing to adapt. But one of the things people keep talking about and is on the top of mind for most folks is AI. And when we think about women in leadership positions, we need to think about not just what it is to be a leader, but also what it is to be a woman in tech, and then add to that a woman responsible in a leadership position. So here's an example. I'm sure that most folks are probably aware of this, but here's an example of an article that came out in the New York Times talking about, the thought leaders behind AI. And of the folks that they recognized, what percent do you think were women? Yeah, the answer is none. And so we know we have a gap when it comes to women in leadership positions within tech. In fact, over time, the percent of women in leadership roles within tech has decreased significantly. And even in the last few years, it has continued to nosedive. So as we are looking at some hazards for leading in tech, given that this is the day of security, let's talk about the dangers of being a woman leading in tech. And some of that is going to be isolation, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later. And women who are leaders in tech have a higher percentage likelihood of leaving their role. This was looking at men versus women, so 45% more likely to leave their role and 50% more likely than men to leave their role before they turn 35. So we have, even if women are stepping into roles, they are also exiting at a pretty high rate. And we have to wonder what's driving that, right? What's behind that? So we have an opportunity for you to check in and see how you're doing as a leader in tech. So we're going to do a quick survey and assessment that will help you identify how you're doing as today and in your role. So we're going to ask a series of questions that will help gauge how we're doing. These are on a 1 to 5 scale. So if you want to just write down your answers as we go. We have 12 questions, and then we'll calculate and add those up at the end. So the first question is, just on an everyday basis, or from a frequency perspective, how often do you feel just like quitting? 1 if never, 5 very often, and then somewhere in between. I don't take pride in my work. How often is this something that you feel or experience? Again, 1 if never, 5 very often, or somewhere in between. People or issues easily get on my nerves. Again, use the same 5-point score. I feel like my workplace is toxic. I don't have as much time to plan as I like. I seem to be forgetting things or not as sharp as I once was. I don't think positively about my job. Thanks for the thumbs up. I don't feel like I have anyone to talk to. Again, just write down your scores as we go through, so you can calculate where you are. We're going to talk about this one a lot, actually, later on. I feel unappreciated or undervalued. I can be unpleasant with people when they don't deserve it. I feel low physical or emotional energy. I'm unclear or confused about what I need to do at work. So add up your scores, and you can see these are based on research around burnout. And so you can see where this puts you as far as your risk of burnout. Notice any where you had a 5, because you want to really pay attention to that. So just keep that top of mind for you as we go through the rest of the presentation, because it's important for us to be aware of how at risk we are for burnout. I'll talk a little bit more about burnout next, which is there are specifically identified causes, common causes, or what I call hazards, that exist in the workplace that can increase the likelihood of us experiencing burnout. Does it guarantee that we will get to burnout? Absolutely not. But these are at least 6 of the identified and researched causes that can increase or accelerate the risk of burning out. And so I want to go through a few of these with you in more detail. We're going to talk about workload, we're going to talk about alignment of values, and we're going to talk about feeling secure in your role, and how that can play and show up and increase the likelihood of burnout. So with workload, this is obviously an area of concern, given how quickly things are changing, how nimble we're being expected to perform, the concept of doing more with less, or having an entrepreneurial spirit. It can be sometimes overwhelming as far as the workload. One piece of data that I like to share with people so they have context is that our brains evolved over 200,000 years to exist in a very specific context. 100 years ago, our lifetime amount of information that we absorbed equals the same amount of data that we absorb in one day now. And so our brains haven't had a chance to really catch up to that volume and level of input. And so this was I like data. This is another study that looked at IT workers and their kind of information overload at work. And it showed that 90% of workers feel that they have too much information coming at them. If that's something that you can relate to, put a thumbs up in the reaction for me. Anybody here feeling overwhelmed with work, too much information? Yeah, see, at least one of you. So paying attention to workload is important because you need to see what's impacting your mental health as both an individual contributor, if you're a player coach, and as a leader. So here are some questions to think about when you think about the workload for yourself as well as your team. Is it consistently overwhelming or unmanageable, or is it come in fits and starts, right? Are we consistently having to work long hours or excessive overtime? Are deadlines unrealistic and success metrics either unclear or also unrealistic? And do we have adequate staffing to get the work done? It's okay to have, time periods or crunch times or areas when we have to just kind of get things over the finish line. But if that's your constant way of working, you are increasing exponentially the risk of burnout for you and your teams. So pay attention to that. The second one is values. And you may think, what does values have to do with work? It's just work, right? But what we have found is a couple things. One, many of us spend a large percentage of our lives at work. And so if what we're doing doesn't align with who we are and our values as humans, it's been shown that can increase our likelihood of burnout. But if it does, it actually can correlate to a higher level of engagement, as much as 54% increase in our engagement with work because we find it meaningful. And so looking to make sure that your values and your purpose, what you believe in, is represented in the organization that you're a part of is really actually pretty important when it comes to not just you as an individual contributor, but you as a leader. Because as a leader, you are the voice of the company. You represent the company. And if your values don't align with theirs and you're having to represent that, that can increase your level of exhaustion. So some questions to ask yourself. Do the leaders or executives align to the values of the organization? We have written, does it match what we do? Are you asked to sacrifice standards that are important to you? Are you asked to treat people in ways that you find inhumane? Or are you being asked to do things that you feel don't match with who you are as a person? Is ethical behavior encouraged and unethical behavior dealt with swiftly? Sometimes we have, my friend calls it the brilliant jerks, right? We tolerate negative or destructive behavior because somebody's really good at something, or they're the only ones who know X, Y, or Z. If that's the case where you are, then that's a values conflict, right? And can you stand behind decisions made by leadership? This isn't the same as always having to agree, but can you follow the logic, and does the logic match from an ethics perspective who you are as an individual? And then security. Now, this is a big topic, right? Because we've had a lot of layoffs in the last couple of years. And you can see some of that here. This is just tech service layoffs and then different industries in tech. But we've had just across the board a huge influx of layoffs. And that damages not just the people impacted, but also the people who remain. In fact, research shows that the folks who stay behind, who are not impacted necessarily directly by the layoff, they have an 8% or higher likelihood of leaving within the next 3 months. And they experience something called imposter syndrome. We call it in a fog. Sorry, I'll talk about that later. But they experience a lot of big emotions and have an emotional response when people that they work with, that they trust, that they value, are laid off. And so they call this actually being a layoff survivor in the psychological research. So some things to ask yourself about feeling secure in your role is, have there been recent layoffs or frequent reorganizations that don't make a lot of sense, or, that kind of don't seem to ladder back to the finances of the organization? Are you given feedback on your position that helps you understand how much you're valued and how your performance is being assessed? Often we avoid these conversations because they're difficult, and then you can end up surprised during my least favorite time of year, performance review time. Are there frequent changes in job responsibilities? I mean, the resounding answer to this is probably yes, given the work that you do. And working with other tech companies and cybersecurity organizations, this is a big yes. And so that can make things feel overwhelming and like it never settles down. And are you concerned about how politics at work? And I don't mean politics as in, our government. I'm talking about those political moves that happen. Are some of those at play that make you feel less secure about your role and how you are valued or seen? So as I said, these are documented correlations to an increased risk of burnout. And this doesn't mean you'll necessarily have burnout if you experience them, but if these occur over a long period of time, or while other stressors are happening, or just if it's specifically a trigger for you as an individual, many things can cause this to ultimately lead to burnout. And when we talk about burnout specifically, there are three recognized symptoms of being in burnout. One is, and you'll recognize some of these from our quiz we did earlier, one of these is that physical or emotional exhaustion, just feeling like you don't have the energy, you can't get through the day. And this, in the research we saw earlier, exhaustion and feeling exhausted at the end of the day, we'll see some more data later, it tends to be pretty common in the tech space. Cynicism, right? Distrust, not believing that people are saying things that are true, and just kind of that general side eye. An increase in cynicism is one of the three symptoms of burnout, as is a decrease in cognitive ability. Now you'll see this referred to as performance, but if you find that you're fuzzier and unable to do things maybe you were able to do before, that might also be representative of burnout. So just to check in with the group, give me a thumbs up if any of these feel familiar to you. If you've experienced exhaustion or cynicism, or feel like you're not as sharp as you once were, go ahead and give us a thumbs up. At least one person. There we go. Okay. I hear clapping, so I don't really know what that means. Yes. Okay, good. Well, you know what? You're in the right place, because we're going to give you some skills you can use to help bounce back from that and help counter that burnout from having a negative impact on your mental health. And here's the thing. As leaders, what we tend to do is we tend to put the needs of others above ourselves, right? And we take pride in that. As servant leaders, right? We put other people ahead of ourselves. And we find sometimes we don't necessarily set boundaries. We feel like it's the thing we need to do to protect our team, to do right by our team. Or, we find ourselves not taking care of our own needs. So, for example, one study showed that over 60% of managers skip a meal every day as a result of work. And then equally large percentages of people skip taking vacations or have sleep problems as a result of work. And so all of these things, including the issues I just talked about before, increase the likelihood that we can become burned out. When we're burned out, it wreaks absolute havoc on our teams. And this study, for example, showed that it has a huge impact on psychological safety within the team, feeling supported, feeling like the work they do is properly rewarded. And then ironically, it actually increases the perception of workload for our teams when we are doing things like trying to take on more so they don't have to. So it is counterproductive to get all the way to the burnout, not just for ourselves, but also for our teams, who in many cases we're making these sacrifices for. So I want to talk a little bit about 5 specific hazards for women tech leaders. Now, I didn't give you this warning in the beginning, but I'll give it to you now. You may feel like, wow, this is a real bummer of a presentation. Like, I don't want to hear anymore. I've already heard enough. It's getting me down. But I promise, by the time we end, you'll walk away with specific skills that you can apply that have been based on science to help counterbalance these and help you bounce back more quickly. So it's a bit of a roller coaster ride. So just if you hang with me, I promise we'll get to the good part. But I think what's important for us to be aware of is, what are these hazards? Because in many cases, the comments I see are, I thought that was just me. And what I'm here to tell you is, it's not just you, and it's actually been researched for decades and proven to be pretty common. So you're not alone. And that in and of itself is helpful. All right. So the first one is masking. Now, I'm going to point this out for women leaders in particular, because when we walk into the room, there tends to be more bias about who we are and how we show up. And so in trying to show up in the way that we think we should, we tend to put on what's called a mask, or pretending to be something that we're not. And let me show you the study that was done during the pandemic. So this looked at women in STEM and how they responded to working remotely, what I'm doing right now, right? How did they respond? And what they found was, a lot of women, the majority of women, they had what they called image or impression management. So they would do things like not use their webcam, literally making themselves invisible, positioning the webcam to avoid showing anything about their personal life, no pictures of kids, nothing personal in the background, use virtual backgrounds pretty regularly, or buy furniture so they could have a more neutral or professional background. They found that women were less likely to talk about personal topics like having to go get the kids, or any kind of parenting demands, than their male counterparts, because the expectation was that they're trying, the masking that they're trying to maintain is, I don't have those things. I can just focus on work. And so when we do that, some of us call that being professional. We put ourselves at risk of burnout. So masking is hiding your authentic self in an effort to gain greater social acceptance. I see some of you responding that sounds familiar. Yeah, absolutely. And so when we do that, it increases our risk of emotional exhaustion by 40% when we try to be perfect, or we try to perform to some kind of fictional stereotype, and our increase of stress doubles. So, one of the reasons I talked about values alignment is, research shows that if we are closely aligned to our values, if we're very clear about our purpose for why we do the work we do, then we are better able to actually protect ourselves from absorbing these biases, which makes us less likely to feel the demand to practice masking. So if this is something you do to get by, I just want you to be aware that it is a potential hazard for you from a mental health perspective. And so make sure that you're taking time to just take the mask off and be yourself, and see how much you can start to be more comfortable with being authentic and being you. Second one is exhaustion. I talked about this earlier. So there was a big research study done in 2022 about burnout in tech. So some of these data points come from a couple of years ago, but I'm going to suppose that the data is probably still the same. And so a lot of feelings of exhaustion, go to bed feeling exhausted, wake up still feeling tired. And so tech workers, according to this study, 56% of tech workers feel exhausted at the end of the day. And this goes up when they're responsible for leading other people, because we have to manage the demands of other people and, respond to requests and make sure we show up for them, all the things. And so exhaustion is a big risk for tech leaders, especially women tech leaders. So one of the things to think about is, how often do you struggle letting go of the stresses of the day? We take it with us. Like I said, a large percentage of leaders have problems with sleep because they're keeping those things with them when they come back home. All right, third one, I talked about this a little bit earlier as well, is the pace of change. It used to be that we believed that we could have a change, we implement it, and then things go fine, and then we have another one, and that's the cycle. I'll talk more about that in a second. But we have to be able to pivot and move. Things are changing so quickly, especially in cybersecurity in particular. Again, like I said, I work with organizations in this space, and it can be exhausting trying to keep up with everything that's changing because it's changing so quickly. And so that is something to pay attention to. If I've had a lot of changes, right, what am I going to do to take care of myself so I can recover and step back into the game? Because like I said, it used to be we'd go through this lovely change curve, we get to integration, blah, 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 and there'd be some other change. But we are experiencing such colossal change over and over and over that it can lead to change fatigue. And change fatigue is some of the symptoms of it sound a little bit like burnout, which is cynicism and a lack of energy around the change. And so if you find that you're kind of like, I'll worry about the next one, or you just can't get energized, all those things, you may be experiencing change fatigue. Again, this is just a hazard for us to pay attention to. There's nothing you can do to stop the change from happening, but there are things you can do to help you navigate this continuous change curve that we keep experiencing over and over again. So some signs that you may be experiencing change fatigue might look like questioning the value of changes, finding yourself kind of in that devil's advocate role, having apathy, like I said, a lack of energy. One way that people may display change fatigue is by info hoarding. So if I feel like, I don't know if I want to share this, or I'm keeping information to myself, if I'm honest with myself, that might be something to pay attention to. Again, I mentioned cynicism and distrust, but change fatigue can also look like poor decision making or the inability to make a decision. So kind of waffling with decisions or spinning with decisions. Again, all of these can be signs of change fatigue. If any of these sound familiar to you, or you've seen this in other people that you work with, give me a little thumbs up. All right, let's see. It looks like we got some. Okay. All right, so, and then we've asked this question about seeing change fatigue. Okay, so constant threats. So cyber, I'm going to read this because, and I hate when people read slides, so I'm just going to read it because it's really poignant. Data demonstrates that cyber attacks arouse equally high levels of psychological distress as conventional warfare, an outcome fraught with far-reaching consequences. So there's been studies now following cyber attacks that show that people who are on the front lines of those cyber attacks also will experience the equivalent of post-traumatic stress symptoms. And so because our brains, they don't recognize a physical threat as being different than a theoretical threat. And especially as cyber attacks become more visible in the real world by attacking infrastructure or putting people in harm's way, those threats are real and are physical. And so that can impact how we psychologically respond to those attacks and it can mirror what we would be doing if it was any other kind of attack from a terrorist or other cause. So this is something to pay attention to, because feeling like we're constantly on the edge of threat, again, as you can imagine, can have a high impact on our emotional well-being and our ability to bounce back and navigate from challenges. So this was a study about the attacks having impact on tech worker mental health. One study showed that 54% of tech workers had a negative impact on their mental health, and 56% feel like work is getting more and more stressful every year. Finally, number 5, imposter syndrome. So imposter syndrome is that we talked about masking earlier, but imposter syndrome is the belief that other people see us as more talented than we really are, or that we're going to somehow get found out for not being as qualified or talented or knowledgeable about the work as we may feel like we should be. This is particularly a threat for women. We talked about this earlier, but the likelihood of us to absorb biases is pretty high when we work in environments where we were underrepresented. And so imposter syndrome can flare up and cause insecurities and self-doubt. Oops, wrong way. So there was a study from IT professionals across 5 countries, and that believe that the hard skills that they need is changing, and it's changing very quickly. It's easy to feel like an imposter if I don't know what I need to know, right? If I'm unable to keep up with the skills needed to be successful in my role. And so this is another thing to watch out for, is those feelings of imposter syndrome. In fact, this CNET survey from 2018 showed that 58% of tech employees experience imposter syndrome across a wide variety of brands. All right, like I said, this is the downer part. Now we're going to do the fun part, or the healthy healing part. What can you do? And there's a ton you can do. And this isn't just based on my opinion. I've actually done a ton of peer-reviewed research that is included in here. So this is all based on the data analysis done by scientists, psychologists over the last several decades. I tend to pull from studies that are in the last few years because, the pandemic, but all of these have been proven over and over and over again to be helpful in building skills to navigate the challenges we just talked about. So nothing here is just based on, my opinion. And I categorize these as really called resiliency skills. Now, all of us have resiliency skills. In fact, research shows that we all have at least 10 different coping mechanisms. Now, 8 of those are helpful. Not all of them are helpful, but we do have the ability to cope, right? None of us are not resilient, otherwise we wouldn't be here. But we can continue to bolster and improve and increase our toolbox of resiliency skills by learning more about the psychology of how we react in these situations. So making ourselves aware of the hazards is one step, but then knowing what to do when these come up is the other. And so resiliency is the psychological strength to bend instead of break when we're facing hardships or challenges. And we're going to do this using something called neuroplasticity. Now, normally, if we had an interactive, I could ask you to define it for me, but I'll define it for you. And so neuroplasticity is really about the ability for the brain to form new synaptic connections, so new neural pathways. And the reason why this is worth mentioning is that up until a few decades ago, we believed that once your brain developed, and that's about around age 25, 27, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? We believe that your brain, once developed, it was set. However, we know now through neuroplasticity, which is repetition and reminders and other tactics that can help us create new neural pathways or new habits. So we're going to be using neuroplasticity to help us bolster against some of the hazards we just talked about. So I'm going to give you 4 tips that you can apply today in our last remaining 18 minutes. You're not going to want to use all 4. We will be successful if you find at least one that you will be able to apply right away. So I use this very fun acronym of the YMCA because it helps me remember what these 4 tactics are. And that stands for understanding yourself and your special, what makes you unique and special. Then practicing mindfulness, self-compassion, and acceptance. And I'm going to talk about each of these in more detail. So let's talk about getting to know you. One of the most powerful things you can do as a leader is take time to actually self-reflect and just check in with yourself. I'm not talking about spending 30 minutes doing anything extravagant. I'm talking about just taking a few moments to say, hey, how am I doing? How am I feeling? How's it going? Checking in. And research shows that if I could just spend 15 minutes a day, after 10 days, I'd have a 25% improvement in my overall well-being. That's a very simple ask. You can easily find 15 minutes, right? You brush your teeth, right? There's a few minutes right there. The time between meetings when we're waiting for everyone to join the Zoom, instead of checking email, which chances are you might get one out, spend that time on you. Check in. How am I doing? How am I feeling? What am I excited about? What am I nervous about? Taking the time to check in with yourself is a great investment in helping you recover and refill the tank when you're dealing with all those hazards we just spoke about. Now, here's the common response I get when I talk about this, which is I don't check in with myself because I'm afraid of what I might find. We need to be able to build relationships with ourselves in order to be able to take care of our teams. And so start practicing self-reflection. You can just do it through inner dialogue. You can do it through journaling, however you choose to. But if you could just spend 15 minutes every day just checking in, you'll see a huge improvement and will help you recover from some of these hazards you deal with every day. All right, mindfulness. I have to be honest. When I first started doing all this research, I was really disappointed to find mindfulness as one of the highest correlations to better outcomes in the midst of challenges and some of the hazards we talked about, because I'm a terrible meditator. I have just too many ideas flowing through my head, but mindfulness is not the same as meditation, is what I've learned. And so you can practice mindfulness in very simple ways. In fact, if we have time, we'll do this at the end of our session together. But mindfulness has a huge impact in our ability to stay agile, manage change, be innovative, be open. When we practice mindfulness, we're able to increase our ability to do the work that's asked of us. And so it's important for you to identify what does mindfulness mean to you. One of the things I find really helpful is to think about the Chinese symbol for mindfulness, which is a combination of present or right now and heart. So mindfulness is really about checking in on how I'm doing right now in this moment without judgment and without trying to control those thoughts or feelings. Speaking of not trying to control things, our third tactic we can use is something called self-compassion. Now, you may roll your eyes, right? Oh gosh, this is like a spa day or whatever. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is taking the time to speak to yourself with kindness and care and appreciating the hard work that you do every day. Often we speak to ourselves like we wouldn't speak to anyone else. We speak to ourselves harshly or with criticism, but in a way we would never speak to anyone else in our lives. So self-compassion flips that script so that we can speak to ourselves with kindness. In fact, when as leaders we spend time practicing self-compassion, we increase our transparency with ourselves or self-disclosure. That goes back to self-reflection. Our ability to bounce back, there's our resiliency, and then our overall self-esteem increases as well. So there are 3 ways to think about being self-compassionate. One is to practice speaking to ourselves with kindness versus judgment. the second way we can practice self-compassion is by connecting with other humans, doing exactly what you're doing now. Go out and find someone you can connect with as a human being. Find others who are going through the same things that you're going through. But also be clear about how your experience is not unique, right? You are not the only one who feels lonely or imposter syndrome or overwhelmed because of work or, has problems sleeping. That doesn't mean you're broken. That's something that most people experience. Now, what do we want to do about it, right? So, and then also reminding yourself you've overcome many things in the past, and more than likely you can overcome whatever it is you're facing today. So finding that human connection, the way in which your experience is universal, so to speak, or really based on who you are as a human. And part of being a human is being flawed and making mistakes and not being perfect. And then the third part of self-compassion is to be mindful. Here we go again, which is be thoughtful about the words you choose to use with yourself. One of the big alarm bells that I talk about here is the word should. If we find ourselves using the word should, I should feel this, I shouldn't feel that, I should have known, that's a big alarm that tells me I'm in a place of judgment, right? So be careful and thoughtful about the words you use when you talk to yourself. Okay, last one, acceptance. So I've talked a lot about some of the hazards that can happen for women in tech, right, as leaders. And we could sit here and be upset about that and angry and all the things. But what we need to also do is we need to accept what we can and can't control. And one of the things we can't control is other people's opinion of us. We can influence it, we can do our best, but we cannot control what other people think, including if they come to the table with biases about who we are. We have to accept sometimes the world isn't how we'd like it, and then we have to decide, what can I control? Often it's not much, but we put this pressure on ourselves to somehow be able to control what other people do, think, or say. And that is incredibly unproductive. So if we can practice acceptance, which includes accepting that sometimes things are hard and sometimes we make mistakes, we're better able to bounce back from challenges. So this is not the same thing as ignoring toxic or abusive or otherwise unacceptable behavior. That is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, this person emailing me when I told them not to email me. That's not because I failed to explain it. That's because they chose to do it, right? So it's about finding those things that we're trying to control that really are not controllable. And that also includes being the best leader for every single person on your team. That's unrealistic. You're going to be the best leader that you know how to be, but sometimes you're just not going to be a right match for everyone on your team. And that's going to have to be okay. You just have to know that at least I did my best. And the second piece about acceptance is also accepting that sometimes things go wrong, right? Everybody's trajectory up. We have ups, we have downs, and that's just part of being alive. That's part of being human. And then finally, speaking to ourselves and accepting our own strengths and flaws as we experience being a leader for others. And so speaking in an accepting tone with ourselves is one way that we can help bounce back from challenges and hazards. And some of the acceptance is, gosh, this is a highly dynamic and stressful time within technology, within cybersecurity in particular. Yes, there aren't as many women in leadership positions in tech as there used to be, and that's a problem. That doesn't mean that I can't do that. That doesn't mean that it's not possible. It's just information. So, since we have time, I would love to do a short mindfulness activity with everyone. And by short, I mean 90 seconds. So the other thing I want to kind of remind everybody about mindfulness is it does not have to take time. You don't have to have an app to practice mindfulness. All you have to do is find a way in which you can focus on something, be it your thoughts, your breath, a visual, finding patterns that you can count, whatever works for you. find that thing that helps you, and you can do that quickly. So this is one of my favorite things to do, and it works really well if you spend a lot of time in meetings like this. And it's called boxed breathing. So what we're going to do, and it's not even going to take us 90 seconds, to be honest, is we're going to practice breathing by inhaling and as our eyes follow along the edges of our screens. So we'll inhale in the corners, and we'll exhale as our eyes move across the screens. And we'll do that 4 times as our eyes go around the screens. So let's all start by taking a big breath. And then we'll exhale as our eyes move across the top of our screens. And then let's take another big breath. And then exhale as we move down the screen. Inhale in the bottom corner. And then exhale as our eyes move down the bottom of the screen. And then inhale in that bottom left corner, big breath. And then exhale as we move up the top of the screen. Now this is something you can do without anybody knowing that you're getting your breath back, right? And this can be when I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm feeling like I don't know what to say. Whatever my response is, you can use this to help you bounce back and navigate those hazards that we talked about. But with that, let me wrap up. I'm ending a little bit early, but that'll give you time to take a you break, practice some self-reflection. Feel free to reach out to me. That QR code works to go to our website. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. I put my LinkedIn link in the thread. And you know, I always love to make new friends, so please reach out to me. I'm also on TikTok as your HR Big Sister. If you're over there, while it's still available on TikTok. And I have additional questions you can use with the other hazards that we didn't get to in the burnout section. Again, if you're interested, just reach out to me and we can share that with you as well. And thank you for taking the time to invest in you as a leader. As leaders, as women, we tend to not take care of ourselves. And this is your permission to take a moment and practice either self-reflection, self-compassion, mindfulness, and acceptance so that you can practice the YMCA. Now, last thing, for those of you left, here's how you can also remember this. So we've got the Y. Everybody do this with me. I know, I can't see you. Y, this is opening up to who you are. M, mindfulness, pointing to my brain, right? What am I thinking in this moment? C, which is for compassion and giving ourselves a hug and being kind. And then A, which is like an umbrella, which accepts the fact that it's raining and there's nothing we can do about it, but make sure that we don't get wet. So with that, everybody, thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of the event and take care of yourselves.